All right, so tonight, if you have your Bible, we are going to pick up where we left off last week in 2 Samuel chapter 24. So last week, we began our conversation in 2 Samuel 24, and we looked really at the first 9 verses. But just by way of recap, let me just remind you of what we talked about last week. We talked about the fun conversation between 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicles 21 and the process by which David was motivated to conduct a census. And so David took a little over 9 months to conduct a census of the entire community, somewhere over 1.3 million people that were part of this census. And in the course of that, David came under with Nathan, where 2 prophets of the Lord during that time, both of whom were active during David's ministry. And Gad is the prophet who is going to speak to David here. Remember, it was Nathan who confronted David after David's sin with Bathsheba. This is Gad now, but I want you to note verse 10. The Spirit of the Lord is working in David's heart even before the prophet of God confronts him. All right, so now, pick up with me in 2 Samuel 24, verse 10. Now, David's heart troubled him after he counted the people. And David said to the Lord, I've sinned greatly in what I have done. But now, Lord, please overlook the guilt of your servant because I've acted foolishly. When David got up in the morning, the word of the Lord came to Gad, the prophet, David's seer, and said, Go speak to David. This is what the Lord says. I'm imposing on you 3 choices. Choose for yourself one of them, and I will do it to you. So Gad came to David and told him, and said to him, Shall 7 years of famine come on you in the land? Or will you flee for 3 months from your enemies while they pursue you? Or shall there be 3 days of plague in the land? Now consider, see what answer I will return to him who sent me. David said to Gad, I'm in great distress. Let us now fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great, but don't let me fall into human hands. So in an unusual moment, David sinned against the Lord, was convicted, the prophet of the Lord came, and God says, okay, there's judgment for sin, because there's judgment for all sin. God judges sin, he did then, he still does. By it, he even confessed his sin before the prophet of the Lord came. So now, the Spirit of God's working in David's heart, and the prophet of the Lord came not for the purpose of conviction, but for the purpose of judgment. God's going to offer you an alternative. Did your parents ever do this for you? Ask you to choose what your punishment's going to be? Some of you that still remember the switch, maybe you can use the paddle or you can use the switch. Some of you remember that. So Gad came to David and said, God's going to give you a choice. Okay? Here are your 3 options. You can have 7 years of famine, 3 months of fleeing from your enemies, or 3 days of God's judgment. Now, notice that last one. You'll 7 years of famine. I'm sure David understands what that is. 3 months of fleeing from your enemies. David gets that. He's already lived that fleeing from Saul. Or 3 days of plague. Now, it's undefined. 3 days. So 3 days in the hands of nature, 3 days in the hands of your enemies, or 3 days in the hands of God. That's really sort of, or 7 years, 3 months, 3 days. That's the choices that David has. David's quick in his response. I don't want the famine. I don't want to be fleeing from our enemies. But I remember the mercies of God. I'd rather fall into the hands of God. David's already experienced the mercies of God. David knows the mercy of God. And so David says, his mercies are great. Don't let me fall into human hands. And so David now, repentant of his sin. Okay, so a man after God's own heart cannot remain unconvicted in sin. Did you hear that? So David twice called a man after God's own heart. A person after God's own heart cannot remain unconvicted in sin. That's what the Spirit of God does. That's what Jesus said in John chapter 16. I'm going to send the Spirit, and the Spirit brings judgment. He brings conviction of sin. That's what the Spirit of God does. And so if you and I are believers, we're in relationship with God through Christ, sin demands the judgment of God. The Spirit of God brings conviction. So David, now under conviction from the Spirit, God called it sin, and David agreed. I understand. I have offended God. And the very next day, notice David does not call for Gad. God sent him. So as David is pleading, he's repenting appropriately before the Lord. Wish it had been 9 months ago, but that's fine. Better late than never. He's repenting of his sin, confessing that sin before the Lord, and God dispatched. Next day, God sent Gad on a mission to find David and offer David a choice. And David says in verse 14, my translation says, I'm in great distress. Literally, I'm in great bad. Okay? It's bad. It'd be worse if I fall into the hands of everybody else. So David says, I would rather fall on God's mercy. So when we get to the end of verse 14, David's aware he has sinned. He's aware there is judgment for his sin, but he's not asking for there not to be judgment. He's asking for there to be grace in judgment. Okay, so now verse 15. We're going to read the first part and kind of skip over the last part. The Lord sent a plague on Israel from the morning until the appointed time. Stop there for a second. God sent a plague. All right, just like the prophet of the Lord said, from the morning, ostensibly from that morning, when Gad came, until the appointed time. It's a rich word. It's a word that's sometimes used in the festivals. There's an appointed time. It's a word sometimes used in judgment. There's an appointed time. Here, I want you to notice God's not surprised by any of this. There's an appointed time. And so God sent judgment from the morning until the appointed time. So when the angel stops, that we'll get to in just a second, it's not God coming to an aha moment and go, okay, let's stop right there. There's an appointed time. So the judgment started. It started in the morning, went to the appointed time, and 70,000 people died. 70,000. Now, there's 1.3 million. That's a large population. 70,000 people died from the plague. Now, all 70,000 of them were sinful, but they were not guilty of this sin. That was David's. And 70,000 people died because of David's sin. I was reading in the book of Judges recently, at the end of Judges chapter 2, into the first couple of verses of Judges chapter 3. The extended conversation is they're trying to take the land of Israel. So Joshua, in the book of Joshua, led the people into the promised land, and they're taking the land. Joshua died, and then there's a series of judges that take place trying to continue the ministry of Joshua, occupying the land. The problem was the Canaanites were still there. And so Judges chapter 2 into Judges chapter 3 is detailing the question, why are the Canaanites still here? That's the question. So God answers the question three ways. So Judges chapter 2, verse 20, God says, you sinned. Canaanites are in the land because you sinned. But then you read the very next verse, which is Judges 2, I think verse 21. I left them there to test you, to see if you'd be faithful. Why are the Canaanites in the land? The Canaanites are in the land because you sinned. And the Canaanites are in the land because God was testing. God does not tempt you to sin, but He does test you. So the Canaanites are in the land because Israel sinned. Canaanites are in the land to test them. Next chapter, first two verses of Judges chapter 3. God says, I left the Canaanites in the land to teach the next generation how to war, how to have battle. In other words, you've got to have an enemy to learn how to fight. So God says, I left them there to teach you. Why are the Canaanites in the land? Israel sinned. God was testing them. God was teaching them. Now, step back from that. Why are the Canaanites in your land? Why does God allow stuff? Why does God allow suffering? Let's just put it there. Why does God allow 70,000 people to die? Why does God allow whatever suffering going on in your life? Well, the big answer is, I don't know. Only God knows. But the Bible gives us some clues. He might be inspecting you. He might be correcting you. Or he might be directing you. Might be your sin. Might be a test that God allows in your life to see if you're going to be faithful. Or it might be God's doing something now for some way he wants to use you tomorrow. He's teaching you. Now, ultimately, I don't ever want to presume to know why God does what God does. I don't want to put words in God's mouth. I don't want to presume to know how God does what God does. But when you look at how God has worked, there's a consistency. God judges sin because our sin demands judgment. But not every moment of suffering is necessarily God's judgment. It could just be that God's allowing it for reasons only known to God. It could be that God's testing us to see if we're faithful. It could be that God's teaching me something. He's preparing me now for something God's going to use me for tomorrow. So here, 70,000 people died. You can't cry unfair because Israel sinned and David sinned. And the really hard struggle of the consequences of sin is that sometimes other people suffer consequences because of our sin. Remember Jonah in the boat? Storm on the sea. Everybody in the boat was sinful. But the storm was not the consequence of their sin. The storm was the consequence of Jonah's sin. They were just suffering because of it. And here, 70,000 people died because of David's sin. And David felt that. You know that because when David came back to the Lord, David reminds the Lord, it's my fault. I'm the one. So the Lord sent a plague. It was there from the morning till the appointed time, and 70,000 men died from Dan to Beersheba. So Dan to Beersheba is a phrase that you will sometimes see. Dan referring to a region in the northern part, not necessarily the city or where the tribe of Dan was, because that's more centrally located, but a region up in the very north around where Mount Hermon was, the extreme northern part of the land of Israel, is considered Dan. Beersheba being the southernmost part of the land. So Dan to Beersheba you'll sometimes see in the Bible referring to all the land. Okay, so Dan to Beersheba, God brought judgment and 70,000 people died. Verse 16, when the angel of the Lord extended his hand toward Jerusalem to destroy it. Now watch this. Now it's coming close to home. That's where David lives. That's where the capital is. That's where the ark is. The angel came to Jerusalem to destroy it because the angel doesn't know the timing of God. The angel doesn't know the appointed time. He's just obeying God like we're supposed to. So the angel came to Jerusalem to destroy it. And the Lord relented of the disaster and said to the angel who was destroying the people, it's enough. Drop your hand. And the angel of the Lord was at the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jebusite. And David spoke to the Lord when he saw the angel who was striking down the people. And David said, it is I who sinned, and it is I who've done wrong. These sheep, what have they done? Please let your hand be against me and against the hand of my father's house. He doesn't know what he's saying, but he realizes the consequences of his sin is now impacting everybody else. So the Bible gives us in a very picturesque scene. You can just visualize it in your mind. The angel of the Lord with a sword in his hand, and I don't know how big the angel was, but big enough that David could see it, and everybody else in the city knew it. And he's on his way to David's house. And God said, "That's enough." Stayed his hand. Remember when Abraham was about to take the life of his son, and God stayed his hand. Here, God stayed the hand of the angel. It's enough. And the Bible records the exact place. Remember, we studied Joshua, and we saw how they marked the place where they crossed the Jordan River. We crossed the Jordan River right there. And you tell your children, when you see those rocks, we crossed right there. Okay, so the judgment of the Lord stopped at this guy named Araunah's house. He's a Jebusite. He's from that region. And everybody knows the angel of the Lord was about to destroy them. And so David, in the rest of this chapter, David, now under conviction by the Lord, realizing I need to make an altar and sacrifice to the Lord, and Araunah, who's so excited that he wasn't just killed by the angel, he says to David, "Look, I'll give you the cattle, I'll give you everything you need to sacrifice to God. I'm just so happy that God didn't kill us." And David says, "No, I will not offer to God anything that costs me nothing." So come to the end of chapter 24. Look with me at verse 22. Araunah said to David, "Let my lord the king take and offer whatever is good in your sight. Look, there's oxen for burnt offering, the threshing sledges, and the yoke of oxen for the wood. You take everything you need. You can break up my carts and make wood for the altar. Everything, king, Araunah gives to my king." And Araunah said to the king, "May the Lord your God be favorable to you." Yeah, I want God to be favorable to you because I don't want him to kill me. "May God be favorable to you." However, the king said to Araunah, verse 24, "No, I will certainly buy it from you for a price." The idea there being the appropriate price. I'll pay you whatever the appropriate amount is. "I will not offer burnt offerings to the Lord my God that cost me nothing." If my offering costs me nothing, it's probably worth that same amount to God. Remember that scene where Jesus is in the temple and he's watching people give gifts, and some of them give very large amounts that cost them nothing. And he saw the widow, and she gave two little mites that were worth very little in comparison, but they cost her everything. And Jesus saw that. And that's what he valued, the sacrifice that was involved. And David says, "Look, I won't offer God something that doesn't cost me something." And now you get to the end of 2 Samuel 24, the occasion of David's sin and God's grace. And it's an awkward place to end the book, because this is not the end of David's life. I don't know if Samuel had in his mind, I'm going to write a third Samuel, but this is not the end of Samuel's life. David's life continues into the book of 1 Kings. So the next book, 1 Kings, chronicles the final days of David's life. And it's, well, you ought to read it. It's a fascinating read. We don't have time to go into all, because they're two very long chapters, but let me just summarize. David's old and he's cold. All right? And so let me just, there's a PG-13 moment that takes place right there. And so just visualize, if he's cold, they came up with some smart guy, it had to have been a guy, came up with an idea to make him warm. Okay? David's old and he's cold. But that's not the end of the story. You get that scene in the first part of 1 Kings, where, by the way, 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 1, David was old. Okay, so David's old, and he's advanced in years. I don't know why the Hebrew has to tell you that twice. It's usually in Hebrew, repetition is for emphasis. He's old and he's advanced in years. Okay, so he's old, and they covered him with garments, but he couldn't keep warm. So he's old and he's cold. All right, and so in the sequence of this conversation, they're wanting to do everything they can for David, who is now enfeebled. Still coherent, but apparently now not losing his faculties, but so focused on his declining health that he's missing some things that are going on. He's still the king, but he's unaware of some things that are going on because the rest of the world knows David's old and cold. David's really not reigning anymore. He's in bed, and they've put blankets on him and girls, and he's still not getting warm. And so David is really not aware of everything else that's going on in the kingdom. And what's going on in the kingdom is one of his sons is taking advantage of Dad's sickness. So opportunistic Adonijah, who fancies himself a good replacement for my father as king. Doesn't matter that David had already promised Solomon and Bathsheba that Solomon's going to become king. Adonijah, seizing the moment, I'll pronounce myself king. And he does. And he enlists some of David's workers, some of David's servants. And so as you work your way through 1 Kings chapter 1, Adonijah has announced in great ceremony, I'm the next king of Israel. And there's an interesting sort of parenthetical thought in verse 6. So verse 5, Adonijah pronounces himself king. Verse 6, and his father had never rebuked him. So, okay, so David does know what's going on. He just hasn't resolved it. He hasn't spoke to the issue. He hasn't said anything about it. I'm pretending like I don't see it because I'm cold. And so all of this is going on. David knows it's going on, but he doesn't deal with it. And so Adonijah, now opportunistically trying to take advantage of that, announces himself king. And now word begins to get out. There's another king. And Nathan and Bathsheba now get involved in the conversation. Nathan goes to Bathsheba. Are you aware of what's going on? Solomon's brother just announced himself to be the king. Didn't David say, your son's going to be king? And so they hatch a plan. Okay, so the rest of 1 Kings chapter 1 is Nathan and Bathsheba conspiring together. First Bathsheba and then Nathan came to David. Bathsheba comes before her husband, who is still the king, and reverently bows before him and reminds him. Do you remember that time when you said Solomon was going to be king? And David says, yeah, I remember that. And right as she's talking, Nathan came in. Good plan. Nathan came in and somebody whispers, hey, David, Nathan's outside, wants to talk to you. Nathan walks in and says, hey, David, I don't know if you're aware, Adonijah just announced himself to be king. And so as you work your way through 1 Kings chapter 1, David is now awakened to the fact that there are things going on that are contrary to God's plan. They say to him, are you not aware? Verse 11, have you not heard? They know he's heard, but he's not acted. And so in a very poignant moment, Bathsheba says to David in verse 20, my Lord, the eyes of Israel are on you. This is that moment, David. You're going to have to get out of bed and address it. And so David does. So beginning in verse 28 down through about verse 48, David addresses that. David proclaims Solomon the king. And as you get to the end of 1 Kings chapter 1, you see David prostrating himself before Solomon, who is now the reigning king. The problem is that left us with another guy who thought he was king. And so the last episode of David's life are a series of instructions, and I'm going to finish with the last one with Solomon. But David leaves the kingdom with some instructions, and that's all 1 Kings chapter 2, where David begins a series of final instructions to Solomon, who is now reigning as king. So, chapter 2, verse 1, David's time drew near. Read into that, he's about to die. So he commanded his son Solomon, I'm going the way of the earth. Be strong and prove yourself a man. Do your duty to the Lord your God to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes, his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimonies, according to what is written in the law of Moses, so that you may succeed in all that you do and wherever you turn. So, David's first instructions to Solomon are, be strong. You read something similar in 1 Chronicles chapter 22 in a little bit more detail, where the chronicler emphasizes that point, be strong, Solomon. It's those final closing words from a father to his son, from a former king to a reigning king. You're going to need to be strong, son. Be strong. That's his first word. Now, when you get to verse 5, David's tone changes. First instruction, be strong. Second instruction, verses 5 and 6, watch out. There's some things going on that you need to be aware of. And so David makes Solomon aware, or reminds him of some things going on in the kingdom. One is Joab, one of the sons of Uriah. So remember Joab, David's military leader? David's first instruction to Solomon, be strong. His second one, watch out for Joab. He's been a thorn in my side. He was my commanding general because I really couldn't get rid of him. But you really need to watch your back. That's David's instruction, verses 5 and 6. I want you to be careful with Joab. He's not going to help you. So verse 6, act as your wisdom dictates. Don't let his gray hair go down to Sheol in peace. Fix it. Okay? That's instruction number 2. Number 1, watch out. Number 1, be strong. Number 2, watch out. Verse 7, instruction number 3, show kindness to Barzillai. I wish we had more time. And I will probably at another time, because it's one of the most amazing stories of a senior adult in the Bible. Barzillai came to David. Remember when David was fleeing from Saul? We read this passage a few weeks back. Barzillai came to David when David needed something. Provided food and cots for them to sleep on. And David remembers, and he said to Solomon, I want you to be kind to Barzillai for me. I want you to be nice to Barzillai. And we learn more about Barzillai here. So David's first instruction, be strong. Second instruction, watch out. Third instruction, show kindness. Fourth instruction, verse 8, handle this one carefully. Verse 8. So notice there's sort of a good news, bad news back and forth with these instructions. Be strong, watch out, show kindness, be careful. Verse 8. You have with you Shimei, son of Gera, the Bethlehemite of Bahurim. We saw Shimei. Remember, Shimei was the guy who threw stones at David and then was first to welcome David back after he realized, oh no, David's coming back. Well, David remembered that. And so David says to Solomon, you need to watch out for that guy Shimei. I told him I'm not going to kill him, but that's not binding on you. It's kind of what David is saying to him. Okay? So I just want you to be careful about Shimei. He cursed me. And notice David says in verse 8, it was a painful curse. But now, verse 9, don't leave him unpunished. You're a wise man. So David says, you're a wise person. You just handle that one. So back and forth. Be strong, watch out. Show kindness, watch out. And the end of David's life is told in 3 short verses. 2 Kings, or 1 Kings 2, verse 10. David lay down with his fathers. He's buried in the city of David, and the days of David reigning over Israel were 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned for 7 years. In Jerusalem, he reigned for 33 years. And then Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and the kingdom was firmly established. We know of David's shepherding skill. We know of his musical skills. We know of his military skills. We know of his influence on people, and we know of his sin. And all of that together is the picture of the man after God's own heart. To be sure, not perfect. Didn't always do things right. Wasn't always the best husband or father. And somehow, God did something for his glory through David's life. Somehow, God looked on David with favor and extended his promise to him. Not so much because of how great David was, but because of how great God is. And so we finish the study of David. God judges sin. And when he judges sin, he's right. But even in God's judgment, God is merciful. And maybe that is a good ending to the study of David. A man who was great in many ways, good and bad. But a man who, perhaps above anything, exemplified the grace of God, received the grace of God, and at times extended the grace of God. And so we learn a lot of remarkable things that need to be a part of our lives, and a few things that need to not be a part of our lives, so that you and I can be people after God's own heart. Let's pray. God, I pray that you find us faithful. I pray that you find us obedient. I pray that you find us, as best we are able, living our faith, speaking our faith. I pray that as we influence people, as we relate to our families and our co-workers and our church family and our neighbors, that the love of Christ is demonstrated through us, that something about your grace in our lives impacts people around us to the end that they desire a relationship with you. So God, do that in our lives. May we be men and women after your heart. To your honor and your glory, in Jesus' name, amen. Have a great week.